All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this Board of Animal Health Quarter 2 webinar. Today, our speakers will be presenting a chronic wasting disease update for Indiana. My name is Dr. Caitlin Macy, and I'm the District 9 Field Veterinarian with the Board of Animal Health, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. We have two speakers today. Dr. Shelly Chavis from the Board of Animal Health is joined by Dr. Joe Caudell from the Indiana Division of Fish and Wildlife. Dr. Shelly Chavis graduated from Purdue University's College of Veterinary Medicine in 1997 and has served as District 3 veterinarian for the Indiana State Board of Animal Health since 1999. Her day-to-day duties involve animal welfare investigations, emergency preparedness, disease traceability, and public health. She's a certified foreign animal disease diagnostician and a member of the Indiana Veterinary Medical Response Corps. Additionally, Dr. Chavis directs BOA's cervid health and chronic wasting disease programs. She uses that experience as vice chairperson for the Farm Cervid Committee for the U.S. Animal Health Association. Dr. Joe Caudell earned a Bachelor of Science in Forest Resources at the University of Georgia in 1998 and his Master's and PhD from Utah State University in 2001. Joe has had a varied career as a wildlife biologist. For the first 10 years of his career, Joe worked in the field of conservation education for the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service. From there, Joe went on to work for USDA APHIS Wildlife Services in Maine, Las Vegas, and Indiana. In 2013, Joe joined the faculty at Murray State University in Kentucky, where he taught a number of wildlife biology and management courses. And in 2016, he returned to Indiana as the Department of Natural Resources Deer Research Biologist, and currently conducts research in most areas related to white-tailed deer, including economics, policy management, damage management, disease, and human dimensions. In his spare time, Joe teaches wildlife management at Indiana University in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs and is a blacksmith in Nashville, Indiana. We will have just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We will have a Q&A session at the end of Dr. Chavis and Dr. Caudell's talk. You are currently all muted. If you think of questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we'll try to address as many as we can. You can either direct them to BOA or everyone in the chat section at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, you're able to receive continuing education credit for this webinar. And if you've signed on in Teams with your name, we've written you down and we'll email your certificate. And if you called in, please email us to let us know that you have joined and we will send you your certificate. So with that, please take it away, Dr. Caudell.
Awesome. Okay, well, I appreciate y'all having me here in the State Fairgrounds today to talk to you about chronic wasting disease. And I'm not going to belabor this, but the slide is there because, you know, we give this to a lot of groups. I think everybody knows what chronic wasting disease is, but it is a neurologic disease of deer that is caused by misfolded prions. It's, of course, infectious between deer, unfortunately, and it can be infected at birth or soon after. Death typically occurs in about 2.5 years after infections. A really bad thing about prions is they will contaminate the soil. Which means it's can be persistent on the landscape, even if you get rid of deer that have CWD. If you get them off of there, that the prions can still be there and actually reinfect other animals. And there is no cure or treatment, and it is always fatal. So, fairly horrible disease for biologists because it's like there's not much we can do about it. But you know, it's just something that we have to deal with now, especially, you know, those of us who manage deer in North America. And of course, you know, the reason we're talking about this now is because we have found it in Indiana recently. Now, this is the distribution of CWD around Indiana, and of course now in Indiana. And it's been close to us for a fairly long time. It's been in Wisconsin since about 2000. Well, we found it in Wisconsin in about 2001, but it was likely it was there, up to 5 or 10 years before that. From there, we've seen it pop up in different places. Some of that appears, a lot of it appears to be through natural spread. Other areas that have popped up is, possibly through movements. We've never really been able to pin down, whether something was a movement or, just kind of natural movement of deer. But, you can see here that it was inevitable that we were going to find it in Indiana, and that's kind of what we've been planning for a while now, especially in those areas that are near Michigan. I mean, you can see up there we had some that were very close to the Indiana border. We've been looking for it there. We've been looking for it in there you go. You got it. Okay. We've been looking for it in Illinois, right at that border there in that part of Indiana. And even now it's cropped up in Ohio. That's still a little bit further away from us, but still kind of in that north central area up there near like Allen County and Wells and some of those Adams up in that area. So we knew it was going to eventually come to us. And so we've been working on developing a plan for, this inevitability that CWD was going to crop up. And so this is kind of our statement of our plan here. CWD, as I said, is a threat to wild-tailed deer populations in the United States, and state agencies have worked to manage CWD within their borders. And they've used a variety of different techniques and stuff that luckily we've had a chance to learn from. And what we've seen is that most attempts to manage CWD have not been successful at slowing the spread of the disease or stopping the increase in prevalence. Therefore, DNR decided to focus our efforts on learning to live with CWD where it's established, and only attempt to control chronic wasting disease where it's most likely to be effective. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about here is how we're going to address CWD where we found it now, and even what we might do in the future if we find it in a place where we don't expect to find it. So CWD has typically been found in one of these three scenarios: in an unexpected part of a state, away from a place that had endemic CWD in wild deer populations. So I'm going to go back here real quick so you can see our map here where we have CWD around us. And so a place where we might not expect to find it, it's, let's say, down in south central Indiana, like Brown County, where I'm at, or Monroe County, somewhere down there, because there's no population that we know of that's right near us. And so this is what we talk about when we talk about it being in an unexpected part of the state. Okay. It can also be near a population where CWD is established or endemic. And thinking back to the map, that's exactly what we were talking about. And is that, if we were looking for it in the areas near Illinois and near Michigan, thinking that that's probably going to be likely where we find it. And then at a captive cervid facility is another place that states have found it. So I don't know if somebody had a question there real quick. Somebody's got a hand raised. Or are you just waving? I mean, that's cool too. Yeah.
It's Greg.
Do you want to unmute him?
I did.
Okay.
You should be unmuted.
You should be unmuted, Greg. If you have a question, we noticed that your hand is raised.
I think he has to unmute himself.
You might have to unmute yourself.
Or put it in the chat.
If you want to go ahead and put your question in the chat, we can go ahead and address that when Dr. Caudell is finished speaking. So thank you.
Cool. Okay. Well, we'll keep on going then. And so, our first detection is near one of these populations where CWD is established or endemic. Okay, and we thought this would be our most likely scenario when we found CWD for the first time. And so, thinking about this again, this is what we were talking about. What would we do if we had found CWD in a place where we did not expect to find it? So again, looking down here in Brown County, if we were to have found it down there, we would have taken different actions, okay? This would have included getting some population estimates of deer. So we actually know kind of what we're dealing with in terms of our deer population. A temporary ban on feeding deer while we kind of, get together and figure out what we're going to do. We have plans to open up additional hunting seasons. And with those hunting seasons, there would be additional opportunities to test because we'd be, at this point, really trying to figure out what the prevalence of CWD is in this area away from these areas where we'd expect to find it. And then if it looked like that sharpshooting would help, we would actually go into this area within about a mile radius of that infected area to try to reduce the population of deer, to really try to get at the number, try to reduce that prevalence of the disease on the landscape. And what we've seen in other states is that this has a chance of working if the apparent prevalence is less than 1%. And so this is why we would do extensive testing before we would make this final decision, because if we do CWD testing in this area and we find that the prevalence is already at 2% or 3%, that would tell us that sharpshooting is going to be unlikely to be effective. And so with our testing, if we found apparent prevalence was at like 0.5% or something along those lines, there is a chance that it would work. And the example of this is what happened in New York years ago, is they had, I believe, 1 or 2 detections. They got in there and did a significant amount of sharpshooting, and they've never detected it since then. And this is kind of the one example folks can use or use when they talk about sharpshooting. And so, but this all depends upon ultimately what that prevalence is. But all these other actions would happen before we would determine if we're going to do sharpshooting. And so, but again, this is where we would, these are our actions if we found CWD where we did not expect to find it. Okay. But in our case, we actually found it in a county nearby where there were wild free-ranging populations that have CWD, which are the ones up in Michigan. Okay. And so in these areas, what we're doing is creating a permanent ban on fawn movement from the CWD positive area to the rest of Indiana. So the area that we designate as being our CWD positive area, and that's a permanent designation. So it's never going to go away. It's like once an area is a CWD positive area, it's just where we presume the CWD is at. People who find fawns can still have them rehabilitated, but only within that area. And but if they, let's say somebody in one of our counties up here, like LaGrange County, was to find a fawn, they cannot take it out of there. So they couldn't take a fawn from like LaGrange County over to a rehabilitator in St. Joe. It has to stay in that area. And the primary reason is so somebody doesn't inadvertently pick up a wild deer that has CWD, moves it to a rehabilitator where it's housed with a bunch of other deer, and then those deer are released on the landscape, because that's has the highest likelihood of spreading it to a different part of Indiana. And we know it's eventually going to spread there, but it's just going to take time, over time for that to happen. So we don't want, our actions to exacerbate that. The other thing we're doing in these areas where the prevalence is starting to get high is allow certain farmers to apply for disease permits to remove wild deer from their properties, just like folks would do if they were having crop damage or, damage to fruit trees and things like that. If the damage or presumed damage is going to be more than $500, they can apply for a permit, and it's based on the size of their land, the value of the crop, and so forth. And we come up with a calculation for how many deer that they can do. Now, this is not an effective means of actually trying to reduce deer in the area, but it is our general policy for farmers, ranchers who have the potential for this damage or experiencing damage to be able to do this. And so it falls into that exact same category. And so these are the two primary differences between our CWD positive area and essentially the rest of the state. Okay, and so here you can see a little bit closer view of what's going on. It's we found. See, I think we've actually got a slide here. Yeah, in the Milford Township. So kind of that you can see here from this map that lower. What would that be? The southeastern corner of LaGrange. This is actually a deer density map that we're looking at here. The yellow is high deer density, at least 40 deer per square mile. On this particular map, we cut it off at 40 deer per square mile. We know that some of the areas just north of that are much higher than that. The area in green, if you're familiar with that area, is Pigeon River Fish and Wildlife area. So it's kind of south of that area. And then the darker the color, is fewer deer per square mile. And so if you're looking at those areas that are kind of dark purple, those are like 2, 3, 4 deer per square mile. And if you're interested, this is actually a post-hunt estimate. So this is the deer that are left after the harvest has occurred for that year. And so this is actually some new data that DNR has been working on getting for the last several years. And we're actually starting a program to go out annually and do estimates of deer population density. And then it gets put into this, what we call a spatially explicit model, which actually gives us a estimate in, at basically the square mile level. So eventually we're going to be releasing a map to the public, and anybody who, would like to use it. Well, I guess technically everybody's part of the public. So that it shows the deer density on a per square mile basis. So we will actually have this in Indiana, and this will be brand new data that we've never had. And just the areas in white that you can see, or maybe it's kind of a gray color, I guess it depends on your computer. Those are areas that are like a solid surface, could be a lake. Like we don't estimate populations in towns, and so you can see like I can't think of the name of the town that's right under the LaGrange word, but that's and like or Topeka down here or Angola over on the eastern side. It's not returning any kind of an estimate in the actual urban areas. Okay, but you can see where we found these positive. There's a significant number of deer in that area, and some fairly high populations. And so, we know from some of the work that we've seen in other states is CWD will move through these areas of high populations much more easily in areas where you have low populations. So again, if you kind of imagine that population size going up into Michigan over there, and we've got fairly dense deer through there, deer probably move through that area fairly freely from Michigan, and we know deer move a fairly long distance when both during the breeding season and just through the normal movements. Okay. So then a question we often get is, why aren't we doing sharpshooting in areas where we expect to find a disease? Especially with this paper, I don't know if any of y'all remember, like this paper came out years ago showing how, and this is kind of the graph that was in the paper, how the Illinois and Wisconsin, when they first found it, were both doing sharpshooting. So like from 2003 to about 2007, and it appeared that the prevalence was staying low from sharpshooting. And then Wisconsin stopped sharpshooting, and their prevalence appeared to actually go up significantly, but Illinois was able to keep their prevalence down, okay? And so for a long time, this was the reasoning for continuing to do sharpshooting, was the thought that was actually keeping the prevalence down. And so if you can see there, this data ended in 2012, okay? So a few years ago, myself, Emily McCallan, the Mariah Bogus, the deer biologist at the time when I moved to a different job for a short time, we started thinking about this and looking at it and went back and created a blank screen with no information on it for some reason. But then we thought about it even more and went with a graph here that actually shows the increase in prevalence over time. And so what we did is we used the data from Illinois and Wisconsin and brought that out to the current year, which now I think would be like around year 20, 21, 22 or something like that. And what we can see is the prevalence was starting to go up at an exponential rate, okay? And so basically what we found is, and so year 30 and 40 and 50, of course, that's just modeling and predicting that out, projecting it out. And we did this like 2 or 3 years ago. And actually so far, whenever we plot Illinois' data on this as we go along, it's actually following that trend. And so basically what this meant is that sharpshooting can buy you a little bit of time here, especially if you find it early enough, and it will keep it flat for a time, but over time it is going to continue this trend upward. The problem is to do that can cost millions of dollars. And so, it's just not a cost-effective method because it's not sustainable over time from a cost perspective. And then in the end, even if you continue to do that level of sharpshooting, what we find is it's just getting away from you anyway. And it's just continuing to go up at an exponential rate. So that's the reason, like, especially in areas where the prevalence is over 1%, and we found that's kind of, once you get outside that 1% area, that's when you kind of, it seems like states lose control of it. So if we're detecting it and prevalence is at that level, then we're saying, especially if it's nearby in other states, it's like it's essentially out of our control at this point. Okay, so a lot of states have spent a lot of time and effort actually going in and doing intensive surveillance to try to find the leading edge of the disease. Another thing we found over time is you really can't detect the disease below 1%. Unless you've got enormous amounts of resources to get out there, and then you could only do that in a fairly small area. For instance, we did this in Franklin County when we were working with bovine tuberculosis, and to get 1,000 samples from 2 areas, and so 2,000 samples total, which is getting into the numbers you need to do a really good job with CWD, cost like $300,000 and had 6 people working in there around the clock full time to try to do this the entirety of deer season. And so to detect it at low prevalences is very difficult. But knowing where you have CWD is and the direction it's growing, because it doesn't grow necessarily like a bullseye, it grows with a shape that's kind of based on what the landscape looks like. We're going to use these modeling techniques, mathematical modeling techniques that are out there that will model the spread of the disease. So it's really to inform hunters and inform the public where we think we have CWD. So if they are concerned and want to have their deer tested, they know they're in an area that's the most likely place to have CWD. And so again, like I've got up there, this is not the actual modeling. This is just kind of how it will look. We're actually working on the models right now. And we know we've detected it here. Our the amount of detection, the amount of surveillance that we were doing would say we would have detected it if it was in 5% of the population. So somewhere between 5 and 6% is what we're presuming right now. That means that in like some sort of a centralized area, it's at a higher prevalence. And then the further you get away from that, the fewer animals you find that are infected. And so the modeling will ultimately tell us, kind of what that shape looks like and give us an idea of the extent of it. And so then the idea is anywhere that the model is telling us that we have a positive deer, that entire county then gets designated as this CWD positive area. Okay. And again, it's kind of the most conservative approach at this, because if a hunter is concerned and wants to know, should I get my deer tested? If you're concerned about it, we're saying that, yeah, if you live in this area, you might want to be testing your deer. Okay. So then over time, we can continue to use the model to monitor the spread or the presumed spread. And so, again, our testing, we should be able to detect it in the areas that's like 6%, 5%, 3%, and so forth, but we still won't know it where it's growing at the far edges. But the model should give us this over time. And so as the model is saying that CWD is expanding, whichever direction it's expanding, then we'll just increase our CWD positive area, which becomes our expected area where we find CWD. And again, if it's in one of these expected areas, we don't go in and do sharpshooting or any of this kinds of stuff. So the model is really going to inform our future management actions, as well as like letting hunters know, I guess the riskiest areas where they might want to get their deer tested if they're concerned about it. Okay, so is everything hopeless? We talked about the disease itself and we talked about where it's at. No, there are actually some steps that landowners can take to reduce the likelihood that CWD will become established. One of our research projects at Purdue has shown that there is this thing called stochastic fade out, where a deer can enter an area and that disease won't necessarily persist there, that it will just kind of burn out. It just kind of fades out, which is probably why we haven't seen it from Illinois yet, because that part of the state is characterized by populations of deer that are dense but are spread out from each other. Okay, and one of the things you can actually do is reduce deer density to reduce the likelihood that CWD will become established. So if landowners are concerned about this, they can actually reduce the deer density on their own properties and reduce the age structure of the deer herd. Some other things they can do is if a deer dies on their property, or after they shoot one, they have the carcass, if they go ahead and just don't let them dispose of it on the surface. A deer that dies out there, I mean, it's no greater risk, but again, this is how somebody can actually decrease their risk. And so if they get out there and they bury it, remove it, double bag it, get it to a landfill, kind of however they want to deal with it, it will reduce the likelihood if that deer had CWD when it died on their property, that it would reduce the chance of another deer getting it. Now, we have no idea what that chance is, but we know that these things are things that can help. Prohibit the use of natural-based lures. Again, this is what landowners can do if they are concerned about it. Again, this might be a tiny risk, but all these measures are about reducing risk. Okay, eliminating deer feeding. So for a landowner that's putting out feed so they can watch deer on their trail cameras, that's going to concentrate deer into like one specific spot. And so if they get rid of that, again, it's reducing the risk. Sample and testing all of their harvested deer so they know if they do have it, if it has showed up, and so forth. So again, these are things that individual landowners can do if they are concerned about CWD becoming established on their property. So, and it's a lot of our messaging that we're trying to get out to the public right now. So I think that's pretty much everything that I had. Yep, that's the last slide there. So
Great.
I'm gonna stop sharing if I can figure out how. Oh, there's a button there. That's awesome. turn on the video. Like I said, turn on the video.
Yeah,
There we go.
All right, thank you so much.
Sure.
We've received a number of questions, so we'll kind of move into our question and answer period. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. We really appreciate it. First question, so we'll just kind of move into questions from the crowd. So how do you estimate the deer populations or density, I think based on your density map? Does it involve surveillance and then estimates?
Yeah, so what we're doing is these are aerial estimates. And so we're using a combination of planes and uncrewed aerial vehicles to go out. We fly random transects. We get our population estimate, and then it can be either used in conventional distance sampling, or we actually have a project with Purdue right now to produce that map that you saw there. We've only got it for about a third of the state, but they are going to be creating that model for the entire state. And so then we go out and do the flights, and then we've got folks who will then update that model so we can get kind of this running estimate every year. And we might only do like half the state one year and the other half the year and kind of go back and forth. But it's done mainly through aerial work. The estimates that we have now was part of a project that tried to figure out the best way of going about this, and that was actually done with camera traps. And so camera traps have a lot more personnel costs involved compared to flights. We found out flights were the most cost effective, even with the expense of renting an airplane and a pilot and all this kinds of stuff. And so our pathway going forward is using a combination of drones that are run by DNR folks, and then right now we're contracting with Purdue to do our flights.
Awesome, thank you. Could CWD potentially be beneficial in reducing the overpopulation of white-tailed deer?
I would say CWD is never going to be beneficial for anything.
Fair enough.
You don't want to rely on a horrible disease to try to control populations. And so I'm going to say no for that. EHD is pretty good at doing that in small areas, but the nice thing about that is short term, it goes away. Yeah, I'd rather have EHD for that than CWD for any day.
Fair enough. All right. For hunters hunting in the area of the CWD diagnosis, should they be concerned about CWD as far as meat, handling, things like that?
So, DNR is we're wildlife biologists, and so we always look to the CDC when it comes to determining, our messaging and what we should tell hunters about that. And right now, the CDC is not saying that it is a food safety issue, but they do recommend that if you test your deer and it comes back positive, not to eat the meat. And we would tell somebody that with any disease. If you have a deer that has a disease that you've harvested, it's just better, safer, not to eat it. And especially if it's one that we're not certain that it would could cause harm to a person. So like a disease like EHD, we know doesn't cause those sorts of issues. But for things like this, we just look to the CDC for that messaging. And right now that's what they're telling us.
Great, thank you. And then another question, how much surveillance will you do next year? Will you do more? Are you planning on more?
Yeah, so what we're doing right now is we are trying to do statewide surveillance every year, okay? And we're doing this through our taxidermist program. And so basically, we contract with taxidermists to pull samples for chronic wasting disease. They pull out the lymph nodes for us. That's actually how this deer was detected. And so we're not limiting where we have these taxidermists at. And so we weren't even targeting this area this year, but somebody had shot at a deer there and brought it to a taxidermist, and that's how we detected it. And so We've been slowly ramping this taxidermist program up over the last few years. Last year was the first year it was like truly operational across the entire state. A couple of years before that, it was more of a trial method. We had like 10 taxidermists here and there, and we kind of targeted in certain areas. And so we are going to probably make a little bit more effort to try to get maybe a few more taxidermists up in that area. And but we don't have plans to like increase our sampling there, but we are presuming that more people are going to want to have their deer tested. So we expect more samples to come from that area. And then if the public wants to have, if hunters want to have their deer tested, they can actually bring it to any of our fish and wildlife areas. And we do have one up in that area. I think if you remember on the map, we had Pigeon River Fish and Wildlife areas. That's one that's very convenient to where we found it at. And hunters, if it's a deer they're not going to have mounted or their taxidermist doesn't participate in that program, they can actually take it to that fish and wildlife area and they can extract the lymph nodes and we'll get it tested that way.
Great. Someone just wrote in, can you describe the testing procedures for CWD? Speaking of kind of those testing.
I mean, I think y'all can speak to that just as well as we can, but I mean, it's, we basically extract the lymph nodes from those, and then our first test that we do is it goes to Purdue and it is a ELISA test. And then if it comes back positive, they send it to the National Veterinary Services Laboratory where they do a IHC test. This is awesome. And so the confirmation is that two-step procedure. But yeah, our samples right now are going to Purdue first, and then of course if they detect a suspect, it goes to the NVSL.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question for Dr. Chavis. How will the CWD diagnosis or detection in the wild affect the Indiana cervid producers?
Okay, so that leads into a whole list of information. So I'll get started here on my talk. So the cervid producers in Indiana should have received a letter by now from the Board of Animal Health, and their letter states which zone they're in. So we had certain zones based on restrictions that a lot of other states have put for states with CWD in their deer. And so we did a zone of less than 15 miles, 15 to 30 miles, 30 to 50 miles, or greater than 50 miles. And that's for their cervid herds in relation to distance from the positive diagnosis. These distances were validated from each premises, from where their deer herd is actually located, their deer pens, to the positive diagnosis. So they should have these letters, and we'll get into here for CVIs what you need to check with on that. But for movements within Indiana, the current regulations for movement within the state have not changed, including for herds that are near the CWD detection. The herds that are within 30 miles, really, for the most part, of the CWD detection are in our USDA herd certification program. And so these herds they're monitored. Each year they've got an inspection. They have to keep inventory records. And then they also have to sample all their mortalities over a year of age for chronic wasting disease. And that's a lymph node and an OBEX is required for that. So the movement requirements have not changed. They still have to keep track of the date they move it, name and address of seller and buyer, addresses, official identification, secondary identification, age and sex of the animal, and TB requirements still need to be met as always. So the changes come for movement out of Indiana. And that's where veterinarians need to know the potential impact for these out-of-state shipments. So most states have some type of restriction on the movement of cervids from states that have chronic wasting disease. So prior to moving cervids from Indiana, the state of destination needs to be contacted to determine the state's import requirements and restrictions. Just as a general rule, just to give you guys some ideas, roughly like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, if they're within that 15 miles of the positive, those states will not accept their deer. Iowa, maybe Oklahoma, some of those, they 30-mile restriction. I don't believe Kansas has any. I was talking to Kansas the other day, but every state's a little different. So just check to make sure. And if the producer does not have their letter that they can show you with which zone they're in to make sure you can write that health certificate, you can call our office, the main line, 317-544-2400, and pick option 5 for animal health. And that will get you to a person that can check that distance. We have the exact distance in the office to tell you where they're at, to make sure you can write the health paper. The herd certification requirements has not changed, just in case a producer would ask you. We do not plan to add any extra requirements such as double fencing, redundant gates, that kind of stuff that some other states have done. We are not planning to change that. We are not planning to change movements into Indiana. That's probably the #1 question I've gotten. Well, now that we have CWD, can we buy from other states that have CWD? And that some of these guys are waiting for that. And the answer is no. Currently, there is no plan to change our import requirements. They're the same. CWD susceptible cervids are not eligible for import from states that have had a diagnosis of CWD within the last 5 years in wild or farm-raised deer. So there are no plans to change that. The other difference that we're talking about are escapes, especially primarily right now in that 4-county zone around the positive. If a whitetail, well, any CWD susceptible cervid escapes, it's required, it is a state law that those have to be reported to the Board of Animal Health within 24 hours of knowing of the escape or the possibility that one may have escaped if the fence is down or a gate was left open. That is still required. That's always been a requirement. What we're changing, and this was a protocol already kind of in the works, is those escaped deer have to be captured within 48 hours if you're going to put those back into your certified herd. They can't remain on the landscape and for a couple of weeks and then add them back for certified status. Not now that we know we have chronic wasting disease in the wild, especially in that area. There may be a little more leniency kind of on a case-by-case basis, in some other areas of the state, but especially up northeast, that's not going to happen. So if they cannot be recaptured within 48 hours, they need to harvest those deer off the landscape, and they are required to be sampled for chronic wasting disease at the producer's expense. That is all I have. Dr. Macy, so any questions regarding farm raises, let me know.
Great. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any additional questions, both CWD, diagnosis in the wild, anything about farm-raised deer, anything like that? Feel free to raise your hand or to add a question in the chat box. We'll just give it another minute. All right. Well, if you have any further questions, please feel free to give us a call at the number that Dr. Chavis had mentioned, or feel free to email us. We're always available to answer your questions. And thank you so much for joining. You will be receiving continuing education credit for this webinar via email in the coming weeks. Again, if you called in, please email us to let us know that you joined, and we will send you a certificate. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to you joining hopefully in the next Q3 webinar in August. So thank you again. Bye.